I am delighted to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Marie Lall. She is Chair in Education and South Asian Studies at the UCL Institute of Education. She's a South Asia expert with almost 30 years of experience in the region, specializing in political issues and education. She's been instrumental in providing thought leadership to development agencies, policymakers, and governments in the region and internationally. Professor Lall has worked with the World Bank, with UNICEF, the British Council, ORSAID, South Asian philanthropic bodies, as well as with various government ministries. In 2019, her work was honored at the House of Commons, and she was also named one of the 100 most influential people on UK-India relations. I don't think Professor Lall needs any more introduction, so without any further ado, I hand over the floor to you, Marie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Henriette. And it's lovely to be back at Lucy because I'm an alumna from Lucy Cavendish from the early 1990s. So it is, although I'm not there physically at this moment, in fact, I'm sitting in France, it's lovely to be able to contribute to those talks that Lucy is organizing. Very briefly, I want to just say that I'm having problems with my, there we go. That I know I'm not speaking to a specialist audience, so I am going to give some brief background on Myanmar. And the focus of my talk is going to be the decade from 2005 to 2015, although I will speak about what happened post 2015 as well. But that's the decade which is least known to most normal lay people. And so do feel free to ask questions about what happened post 2015 and also what happened last year after the coup in the Q&A. I will try and cover as much as I can, but the idea is to take the audience through the main reforms in a thematic way by highlighting the contribution of very specific women that I've worked with, that I know, that I'm close to. Of course, I'm not covering all the women in Myanmar. And in fact, I'm particularly not covering one, Aung San Suu Kyi. I will not speak about Aung San Suu Kyi. We can do that in the Q&A, because I think this time is valuable to understand that she is certainly not the only woman who has contributed to the development of Myanmar. So the country is made up of 7 states and 7 regions and became independent from Britain in 1948. This is after it had been occupied both by Britain and the Japanese during the Second World War, and it was very destroyed after the British had been chased up to Assam and then by the Japanese, and then they chased the Japanese back out. So there wasn't very much standing at that time. There are over 100 different ethnic groups. The majority ethnic group is called the Bama, and there are about 40% of ethnic, what we would call ethnic minorities, but that is a term that is rejected there if they prefer to be called ethnic nationalities or simply ethnic. So when I speak about ethnic people, I mean the minorities in the country. And the Tatmadaw, that's the name for the military, has been in conflict with a number of these ethnic groups, in fact, very specific ethnic armed organizations since independence. So there's always conflict somewhere in the country. The periodization broadly is that between independence and 1962, there was a semblance of democracy, but it was not stable. There was a military coup in 1962. That rule from General Ne Win lasted until 1988, and it was under the Burmese way to socialism. The country was completely cut off from the rest of the world. And 1988, some of you might know, the students went onto the streets asking for economic reforms, for political reforms, and they were gunned down. And the elections were promised in 1990 and held. It's a complicated period, but the result of those elections were not recognized, and we had another military government from 1990 till 2010. In that period, there was some movement towards not democracy, which is why I keep on putting democracy in quotation marks, but what would be a participatory system whereby the military would remain in power in some form, but allow other groups to join in governance. So it started in 2004 with the roadmap to democracy, and that led to the elections in 2010. And we had two governments that were elected. The first one in 2010, the rule was 2011 to 2015 under President Thein Sein. It was a civilianized government, which means that the military took off its uniforms and presided as a civilian government with other political parties as well. And then in 2015, the elections that were won by Aung San Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy. And on the 1st of February last year, we had a military coup, and the clock was rolled back. Right, just some images to give you an idea. I came to Myanmar actually in the year 2000, but I started work in January 2005, working first with the University of Yangon and Mandalay, and then with civil society groups, and then with ethnic armed groups, and then with the ministries and so on. So I've pretty much done the entire round of different types of organization in the country. When I arrived in Yangon in 2005 for my first month in the city, that's what it looked like. And no cars on the streets, no phones, one thin newspaper called the New Light of Myanmar. It still exists. And after 2015, so these are not my photos, these are taken from a website. That's what Yangon looked like. So slight difference. So how did we get from 2005, from what was a military dictatorship where a SIM card for a mobile phone cost over $2,000, to democratic elections? The elections were held democratically. The government was not a democratic government. And there are four main points. I elucidate that in my first book on Myanmar, that if anyone's interested, I can give the details of later on the Q&A. So in the early 2000s, there were global changes with regard particularly to what happened in China that affected the money streams that went to certain ethnic armed groups. But in particular, some of the Myanmar military, in particular someone called Kim Yun, General Kim Yun, who was the head of military intelligence, he's actually the author of the Roadmap to Democracy. He started to negotiate individual ceasefires with the ethnic armed groups. And that peace, which it wasn't peace, it was a ceasefire, but it was an absence of killing, led to civil society being able to actually operate and offer health and education and other services that the government was not doing. Kim Yun became a little bit too big for his boots, and he was arrested or put under house arrest. And that allowed civil society to evolve in the heartlands in Yangon and in Mandalay. And the roadmap to democracy, the democracy in the quotation marks, came to an end, and a new constitution was put in place with elections that allowed political parties to actually function. The last thing was Cyclone Nargis. So unfortunately, a large number of deaths, 100,000 people died, but it actually allowed the international community to start financing or bring money into the country for development, and that continued beyond the end of Cyclone Nargis. So broadly speaking, these four things changed the dynamics and weakened the hold of the dictatorship. And that allowed for civil society to flourish. Now, I start with someone who I call Mummy. She's been my Burmese mother since 2005, when I arrived in the country. And I met Dr. Newan Mao, who became a very close friend and brother to me. And he was the founder of an organization I will speak about in the next few slides, Myanmar Egress. Now, Mummy was a professor at the military academy. And it's interesting when you think about the fact that she's taught social science. She's a devout Buddhist. She's still alive. She's in her 90s. She's outlived two of her sons. In fact, this photo is taken at Newan Mao's funeral. She told me in the many hours that we've spent together, when I go there, I normally go and have lunch with her twice or three times a week. In the many hours that I've spent with her, she's told me how she engaged with the military cadets, and that she was trying to instill what she called Buddhist ethics into what she was teaching. the interesting thing is all those generals who were part of the post-2010 development had been taught by her. Now, what is very clear from this is there would be no reforms without the military. The military was going to have to be part of it. And that's something where she said it's just a matter of teaching them a broader worldview. So this is one of the profiles. And she was the mother of Dr. Myanmar, who was the key person to develop Myanmar Egress. Myanmar Egress was an organization run by 5 guys, but then actually they brought in a lot of women who made a lot of changes. And the idea of Myanmar Egress was to make changes in the country within the allowed legal framework, pushing at the boundaries, but not be part of a revolution, because trying to go against the military would mean you would lose. And by using education, specifically for the adult middle classes, those who had lost out on university education when the universities closed in 1988 and 1990, Yangon University was closed for almost 15 years, to try and sort of educate the middle classes into what it would mean to have elections and participation. And part of that was also obviously through the military networks, inputting what they were doing so that they would not get arrested and so that the institution was not going to be closed. So this was supported mainly by German political foundations for a number of years, otherwise this wouldn't have been possible. But the key thing about Myanmar Egress is, although it started as 5 men, it ended up being mainly women running it. So you have here one of the photos of, in fact, sitting with Aung San Suu Kyi, 2 of the key women who made changes part of Myanmar Egress, Kim Mo Sam and Tae Soo San, who I've been very close to. And in fact, the next photo that I have is at Tae Soo's wedding. She got married to the smiling guy who was sitting behind the roses. And that was all of us at her wedding. Now, the idea was that Myanmar is a very male-dominated hierarchical society. In fact, if you read any of the sort of sociological works on Myanmar, you'll know that in order to be the ideal human is Burma, male, and Buddhist. And that's obviously very difficult for 50% of the population. They happen to be female. And then obviously other parts of the population who happen to be neither Buddhist nor necessarily Burma. But the women tend to be relegated to subordinate positions, although it's not the kind of discrimination you would find in India or in Pakistan. It is much more subliminal. It's much harder to actually put your finger on it. But what I found is that if women wanted to be successful in Myanmar, they actually had to create their own organizations in order to go to the top. Otherwise, they would always be subservient to whoever was the male at the top. Now, Myanmar Egress was different. As the older generation moved aside, they effectively promoted the younger women generation in order to sort of continue the change process. And Myanmar Egress was not only part of, in those first 5 years, it focused on adult education, but in the second 5 years, from 2010 to 2015, it basically ran the peace process. And I'll come back to the peace process in my later slides. So education's always been absolutely key. I spoke about the education of the middle classes, which was something that the civil society did. And Myanmar Egress is just one example. It was the first big civil society organization that functioned, but it was not the only one. There were plenty more and plenty that came after it as well. But Myanmar education, the Myanmar education system there are 4 sort of blocks, if you want. So state education, which runs basic education and higher education. Then there's monastic education for the poorer sections of society. Education is free, but there are side costs from tuitions to uniforms and books. And so those families who cannot afford that send their children to monastic education. But monastic education, with the exception of 2 monasteries, is only for the first 5 years primary education. Then there is ethnic education. That means that ethnic armed groups run their own schooling systems, and I'll speak about those in a few slides' time. And sometimes it's civil society with ethnic groups and ethnic linguistic organizations that bring, that create schools. And then there's private education, which has actually only existed since 2004, 2005, because it was illegal before that. So one thing which happened in post 2010, after the elections that I spoke about briefly earlier on, was education reform. So President Thein Sein had stood up and said, we need national reconciliation with the NLD, we need a peace process, we need economic reform. And then he said, and it was an afterthought, oh, and we need education reform as well. And so what was started was a comprehensive education sector review, i.e. first looking at what there was, funded by the donors, led by UNICEF, and it became the basis for what was then later on the education reform policy. And it was run by Daw Tin Tin Shu, who is an absolutely extraordinary woman. In the way I've never seen someone be so diplomatic. I mean, she was just unbelievable. So she was a Ministry of Education official this was thrust upon her. It was not something that she chose to do. She was in charge of this review. She had to liaise between the donors, the government, the international experts. So all the donors immediately arrived with all their experts. So the British Council with the English experts, and the Australians with someone else, and then the Japanese with the curriculum expert, and everyone sort of landed at her office, and she always smiled, and she always made everything work, and she was always fantastic. And even when UNICEF actually changed the head of the CESR, the international expert head that was supposed to be supporting her 3 times without any notice, she never said a word about it. She was just absolutely fantastic. So she led the review across all sectors of education, and in 3 years produced the reports for phase 1, the phase 2, and a full costing for what it would, what would it cost for the government and the donors to review or to reform the entire Myanmar education system, from early childhood development to higher education. And this is the plan that came out of this, with 9 transformational shifts, including changing things, how the ministry worked, including starting to learn about monitoring and evaluation, a full new curriculum for basic education, adding in, Myanmar only had 11 years of basic education, adding in a 12th year plus a kindergarten year, and big reforms for higher education, which is where I was lucky to be involved again. In fact, my colleague in the audience who was with me is in the photograph here. So this is one of the programs that was actually, this one was run by UCL, but there were many programs run by many different universities and organizations, working with 11 universities from across Myanmar. And what do you see? They're all women. Literally just a handful of men. These are all rectors and vice rectors of the various universities. And the extraordinary thing is, in Myanmar, the schooling system is very female, but the higher education system is also incredibly feminized. So actually, their universities are run by women. Yangon University is run by a man, but even Mandalay University, the second university in the country, is run by a woman. And although I was very tempted to pull out some of the names and photos of these ladies to speak about, I won't do so, because most of these people on the photograph, not all, but many, have joined the civil disobedience movement and are now in hiding. So, but anyway, this shows you that a lot of the transformation in higher education, starting with learning on how to integrate research into teaching and how to collaborate internationally, how to understand a qualifications framework, all of this was run by women. But not everyone was happy with the education law and the education plan, and the students went on the streets, and this was one of the photos that went viral at the time when the students were protesting and the police had enough and decided to beat them up. Women were this is from the press, it's not my personal photographs. My photographs from that time actually don't have many women on them, and they're very unclear, so I didn't want to use them. But women were leading the protests and the marches. What is interesting about that period is that, so we are talking 2014, 2015. So 2015 was when the law was passed and the students had started disagreeing with the whole education reform process from 2014 onwards. 2015, they started marching on Yangon from various parts of the country. And the interesting thing is that the NLD, that NLD was not in power, but was in parliament through the by-elections from 2012, they distanced themselves very clearly from the student protests. And I remember many of the students saying that they felt entirely betrayed by the NLD not supporting them against the government. But the NLD was a government in waiting, so they didn't want to upset the generals who were working with them. The peace process, you will have remembered President Thein said national reconciliation, peace, economic reforms, education reforms. Peace process was actually one of the key aspects of what happened between 2010, or actually 2011 and 2015. And one of my colleagues who I've written a lot with said at that time, Ashley South, he said, this is the best opportunity to resolve ethnic conflicts in the country since the coup in 1962. It was those 5 years, or 4.5 years, so elections are held in November and governments change normally February, March the following year. So that's why the elections are 2010 and this is 2011. The ceasefires that had been brokered by General Kinyunt in the 1980s and 1990s were never written ceasefires, with the exception of Kachin in the north. There was no documentation. And those ceasefires, the original ones, were largely based on the military and the ethnic armed groups dividing the spoils of whatever the illegal trade was that was going on. So this was a quote unquote proper ceasefire negotiation where there would be a roadmap to peace, i.e. very clear documented steps that would engage the EAOs, the ethnic armed groups, and the Tatmadaw to decide who would be control of what territory. Would the EAOs be allowed to continue controlling and governing the territories that were under them, and would they be able to continue delivering the services like health and education they had delivered before? And so these were the kind of discussions that were happening. And first these were individual ceasefires, but then actually it became a joint, a sort of one table. So army on one side, Tatmadaw on one side, and the various EAOs on the other. And key to this was this lady, Janan Latop, who actually had, so she's a Kachin activist. So whilst Kachin, the KIA, they were part of the discussions, but they were very clear they weren't going to sign what was being negotiated for their own personal reasons, in particular because some of the smaller armed groups were not round the table. So she had played a key role. Her father was a Baptist pastor, and he had played a key role in the 1990s and brought her along. And she then was one of those key ethnic activists who managed to put a civil society organization together that helped in education, in development, in issues of language, mother tongue education, and so on and so forth. And this organization is called, it's actually not called Shalom. It's called Shalom officially by them, but it's registered as something different in Myanmar because that was not an acceptable term. It's not a Burmese name. So everyone knows her organization as Shalom, as in peace. And she spearheaded development and education for Kachin, but later across all ethnic states. And she became part of this national ceasefire group. She sat at the table with the military negotiating every single word of this agreement, which was signed by 8 out of the 18 to 20 groups on the 15th of October 2015. So just just weeks before the elections. President Hussein sitting here in the middle, obviously no woman at that table, but actually this would not have come to play if we hadn't had some very key ethnic female negotiators. There were others as well. I'm just portraying her as one of the key players, simply because she had been there for such a long time. Now, if we talk about ethnic armed groups, many people just think of them as people carrying guns, and actually that's really not the way ethnic armed groups function in Myanmar. Yes, they have soldiers who carry guns, but most of the ethnic armed groups are actually governments. They are mini governments of their areas. And in some areas, that means protecting the civilians from the Tatmadaw of the Myanmar army. And in some areas, it's much more than that. It's providing them with a health system, with an education system, with teachers, with employment, all those kind of services that the government is incapable of providing in conflict-affected areas or far-flung regions. So as I mentioned, the ethnic conflict started before independence and has been going on in parts of the country at all times. There's never been a single day in Myanmar where there wasn't fighting. But part of the reason why ethnic armed groups got into schooling was because of one of the key issues around what happened at independence, around that military coup, which required everyone to speak Burmese. So you have over 100 different ethnic groups, so 6 really big ethnic conglomerates, and with very different languages. So Mon, for example, is related to Khmer, and Shan is related to Thai, and Kachin is also the Tibeto-Burman language, but it's a very different Tibeto-Burman language from Burmese. And so the ethnic armed organizations offered mother tongue-based education or mother tongue education, so there's a slight difference. So either some did teach Burmese as well, mother tongue-based multilingual education, and some did not, just mother tongue education in the local language, so that the children who were under their control in the areas that they controlled would be able to learn to read and write. Because what normally happens in an ethnic area is if you have a government school, is the child arrives at the school and has a Burmese speaking teacher and has been speaking another language at home and doesn't know what is going on. And within a matter of weeks, sometimes months, sometimes they last a couple of years, the children drop out. And you have that vicious cycle of poverty that continues. And so the main education departments of the ethnic armed groups are held by the Karen, the Mon, the Shan, and the Kachin. And I've worked with 3 of those. I was starting to work with the Shan when we had COVID and then the coup. So I haven't really developed as much engagement with RCSS as I have with the other 3 ethnic armed group organizations. What's really interesting is how education was never actually part of the discussions of the peace process. And so the ethnic education systems just continued. And it's much more recently, in the last few years, just before COVID struck, that the government education started to engage with ethnic armed group education. We did, however, have well, actually, I'll get to that photo in just a minute. So this is an example of a Mon national school, so quite a lot poorer than a Burmese or a Myanmar government school. Again, very heavily feminized. We have a few male teachers, but most of them are women. And so this was, I think, in Ye in the south of the country, which is just at the border where the New Mon State Party, the armed group from the Mon, control the areas, just at the border between their area and the government area. And so here are 2 women who are key in the Mon movement. So I've chosen those 2 out of the many that one could have chosen. And the one at the front, Misada, is actually, she's not only head of the Mon National Education Committee, which runs 150 Mon national schools and roughly another 120 mixed schools, which means that there are government schools which receive Mon language and Mon history teachers. But she's also part of the armed group executive. She's the only woman as part of the armed group executive. And she's quite something. She's quite a feisty woman. And she has to be dealing with the people she has to engage with. And next to her, Mikun Chenon is someone I've known for many years, very close friend, who set up the Mon Women's Organization and also has inputted into the peace process, but not like Janan that we saw earlier on by sitting around the table with the Tatmadaw, but rather by actually monitoring the agreements on the ground. So she was part of what was called the Myanmar Peace Support Initiative, funded by the Norwegians, which literally went round checking that what had been agreed at the table was being implemented. So walking sometimes for days to the villages on the front line to check that liaison officers had been set up, checking all the kind of sort of nitty-gritty of what was being discussed in Yangon was actually being implemented on the ground. Right, that's the one time where we managed in 2013 to get the CESR. So you have the pink ladies, you can see right, the pink lady right in the front. These are the Ministry of Education officials who for the first time met the ethnic armed group education representatives. And we had representatives from Mon, Karen, Kachin, I'm not sure if the Shan came, Ka'o, Kia, Chin. And so we had representatives from all the various ethnic education systems, mainly run by armed groups, but some are civil society groups. And they all came together for the first time to discuss what role ethnic armed group education and the schools they had would play in the reforms. Unfortunately, that didn't go very much, everyone got on very well at that point, but it didn't go very much further until approximately 2017, 2018, when the process was formally restarted with support from the World Bank, and the Ministry of Education had to sit down, or agreed to sit down with some of the ethnic armed group representatives to talk very specifically about transfers of students from ethnic armed group schools, you know, the whole problems with language and different curricula and different levels, and how that would be, how one could take that forward. And that, unfortunately, they got to some form of an agreement with some of the organizations, and then COVID happened, and then the coup happened. Now, let me speak very briefly about the period which is post 2015. So actually, I knew those two ladies. So in the middle, so Janan's on the left, who we've already spoken about, and Susanna is in the middle, and Shuela is on the right. And so I knew them, all three of them, before 2015, when they were women activists, had set up various women's groups to help women in different situations. So for Susanna, it was as a Karen activist for women who were Karen who needed help. She's Yangon based, and there are so Karen women don't only live in Karen state. There's a big Karen community in Yangon as well. So she was a women's rights activist. And all three of them are actually sitting on my mother-in-law's sofa in Delhi at that point, because they were part of a South Asia women's network. Shuela was trying to educate Burma women, Yangon-based women, actually she didn't care if they were Burma or any other ethnicity, in terms of their legal rights. Both of them became MPs in the upper house in 2015 for the NLD. And in fact, Susanna is now the Minister for Women, Youth and Children's Affairs in the government in hiding, the NUG. So I know through contacts of mine that she is fine, but obviously I have not been able to be in touch with her since the coup. Right, where are we? There are many other women's organizations. So I just want to briefly, before we start getting towards the end of what I want to say that I have not been able to even scratch the surface of all the women that have made such a big difference to Myanmar's development. So there are women's organizations in all the ethnic armed organizations. There are ethnic or women's organizations that are not at all linked to the ethnic armed groups, just like what Susanna had set up. There are business groups. In fact, most of the women I spoke about who were in economic reforms and business They said they left whatever bank or organization they had worked for simply because if they wanted to have an input in how they ran things, they had to be at the head of their own organization. Shwelat set up the Women's MP group in the capital in Naypyidaw. And obviously, most of these women's groups, and there are so many, are linked amongst themselves. I mean, so there's a Myanmar-based links of women's groups, but then they're also linked with Southeast Asian women's groups, and they're linked with the South Asia women's group. And so all of this, there's quite a lot of sort of traffic going on in giving women a voice. And in that sense, Myanmar is quite extraordinary, because a civil society that bloomed after 2005 has made sure that those groups have really been able to have a big impact in women's lives. I want to end my profiles, not the presentation, but the profiles, with one of my close friends, Matengi. So she's now an artist and an author. She's mainly known for her travel logs and on books on Myanmar art and culture. But she used to be Aung San Suu Kyi's PA. She was a political prisoner. In fact, the book that I've featured here is about her time in jail. And she's part of the former Political Prisoners Women's Network. She's fallen out with the NLD, fallen out with Aung San Suu Kyi, disagrees with what most of the women there say, but is an extraordinarily strong person who, I mean, if you want to know what it's like to be a political prisoner in Myanmar, read that book. It's enlightening, and how difficult it is, but also how strong women are. And obviously, given what's going on currently, there are plenty more new female political prisoners. So now, after a decade, we had the 2020 elections in November, and this came in the middle of COVID. And I think for those of you who don't know the country, it is fair to say that when the voters went to the polls, the grumbling about the country was very loud. So there was massive disenchantment with the economy. Things had gone very badly wrong. The ethnic groups were all very upset, because when Aung San Suu Kyi, as state councillor, started running the government post-2015, the peace process deteriorated to a degree that it actually was non-functional. This is after we'd had 4 years of fairly successful negotiations and a very clear path forward. There was obviously international disenchantment with Aung San Suu Kyi. We haven't mentioned what happened in Arakan state, the northern part, the Rohingya movement, fleeing for their lives into Bangladesh. And obviously there was also a lack of a credible alternative. So there was no one else to vote for. So people did vote, and voted strongly for the NLD, but not necessarily because the NLD had done a good job, or not necessarily because people were happy with the NLD, largely because there was no one else. Right, so where are we today? I'm coming to the end, so we will have some time to have a Q&A. At the moment, there's an estimate of about 1,500 protesters killed. It's a conservative estimate. This does not include the bombings of in the ethnic areas and in some of the Burma more rural areas, which I'll speak about in a second, and almost 12,000 arrested. Now, in Yangon, I speak to friends, not every week, but every couple of weeks. People have started going back to work. Schools have started, some parents boycotted, universities are closed, and the banking system is a mess. The main problem is that those who have work are not, if they're getting paid, inflation is so bad that it doesn't suffice to be able to pay for the basic necessities. And many people, obviously, because of what's going on, industries have left, restaurants have closed, hotels have closed, factories have closed, many people are out of work. So there is there is hunger in urban areas. As I said, expected, but there is. Young people, Generation Z, left for ethnic armed group areas, specifically Karen, Kia, and Mon, and got some training, especially in the Karen and I think also in Kachin areas. Some of the young people got trained and have come back as urban resistance with attacking government offices and police stations. There are also pro-military mobs. So the military has its own people that it sends out, which are not necessarily soldiers. There's been the elected government from 2020 has created the National Unity Government, and young people who have taken up arms call themselves the People's Defence Force, but the resistance is fairly uncoordinated. So some People's Defence Force will say that they will listen to the NUG, and some say they are fairly independent. This is the conflict map currently from UNHCR. And so it's everywhere. It's in the ethnic areas where it's always been conflict, and it's in the heartland as well. The interesting thing is in Rakhine, which is the state furthest west, and that's where we had the Rohingya issue. That's quite normal. And in part, that's explained by, well, I may have to qualify what I'm saying, because it's Rakhine geographically sits behind a mountain range. So you'd have to, you have to sort of jump over the mountain to get there. But also, now that the Muslim population has largely been expulsed into Bangladesh or into camps, there is a new ethnic armed group, a relatively new ethnic armed group called the Arakan Army, which sprung up in the last few years, which has been telling the Rakhine people, the fight that's going on the other side of these mountains, that's not our problem. That's Bamars against Bamars. We are Rakhine, we want independence. We need to focus on our fight. And so actually in Rakhine, the schools work, and the university doesn't work, because that's part of the Ministry of Education. Schools are working. People are apparently, going about their daily lives as if nothing had happened. And there are sort of some skirmishes between Arakan Army and the Tatmadaw, but nothing like anywhere else. So it's interesting to see that the one state where there were and so much killing and so much destruction just a few years ago is the one state where actually people can live relatively peacefully at the moment. Right, and I'll end on that. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to say once again, thank you very, very much for a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. And I hope that you'll be back in Myanmar soon, and that you'll be successful, and that eventually everyone will get educated there.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely. It's been nice to be back at Lucy.
Back, yeah. Okay, thank you so much.
Bye.